Okay, so let me welcome everybody to this webinar on trust in science, trust in democracy. It's the second half of a program that we're doing through the Harvard Data Science Initiative and its Trust in Science project. It's a chance for us to hear from a group of people who have more experience with the topic than just about anyone alive. People who are in the medical business talk about quality of life measures. If we had a quality of experience measure, I wonder whether anybody could rack up as high a set of numbers as these four people that we have with us. So I'm Sheila Jasanoff. I'm a professor of science and technology studies at Harvard Kennedy School. I'm the faculty lead for the Trust in Science program. What I want to do now is introduce our speakers in the order in which they'll speak, very briefly, because each one has a resume a mile long. And then each of them will speak for about 8 minutes. And after that, we will have time for Q&A from the audience. So our first speaker will be Marc Lipsitch, who's professor of epidemiology at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health and the director for the Center for Communicable Disease Dynamics. In a way, communicable disease is a technical term, but it could just as well, in the context of our project, be called communicatable disease, because Marc has extensive experience engaging with policy debates on pandemic preparedness and response. He's conducted research on the ways in which immunity, whether by vaccines or through natural means, can affect the biology of pathogens. And since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, he's regularly appeared as an expert helping wider publics to understand the processes behind the sciences that are being drawn upon in the pandemic. Ken Prewitt is the Carnegie Professor of Public Affairs at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. He was, among many, many other public duties, director of the US Census Bureau from 1998 to 2001. Extremely relevant to today's discussion, Ken led a National Academies project which resulted in a report called Using Science as Evidence in Public Policy. And just to give you a sense of the complexity of the problem, the report investigated why scientific evidence is important to policymaking, but argued that an extensive body of research on the use of knowledge has not yet led to a widely accepted explanation of what it means to use science in public policy. Ken is currently completing a book on counting the races in America. Do we still need to? Do we still want to? Our third speaker will be Ruha Benjamin, who's professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, where she is also founding director of the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab. She's the author of a couple of important books, People, Science, and Race After Technology, and editor of the book Captivating Technology. She's currently working on a book called Viral Justice: How We Grow the World We Want, which explores the doubled crisis of COVID-19 and police violence and how we can all be an active part of creating just change. And our final speaker will be Chris Mooney, who is, for the last several years, a reporter at the Washington Post, covering climate change, energy, and the environment. So in that context, Chris has had enormous experience dealing with another area of science-based public policy that has been plagued by problems of trust in science. Chris was part of the Pulitzer Prize winning team that produced the Washington Post series 2 Degrees Beyond the Limit, which documented the places on the planet that are warming more quickly than others. So with those extremely and too brief introductions, let me hand this over to Marc Lipsitch to get us going.
Thank you, Sheila, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm looking forward to a great discussion. I'm going to focus on the COVID experience because it's my life right now and many people's lives, but certainly it's mine. And I want to make a few points. And I think the first one is that it's important that we're discussing trust in science rather than trust in scientists. I think if we didn't know it before, it's become clear during this pandemic that there are plenty of scientists who are wrong about topics of science and who have wild and crazy opinions. Some of those honestly held, some of them self-interestedly held, some of them ideologically held, and some people simply way overstepping their expertise. And I think that the purpose, if there's something to be trustful of, it's the science, not the scientists. And by that, I mean science as a process of updating our views with new evidence, testing hypotheses and the like. And in that regard, I think COVID has been sort of a teachable moment in the sense that there's been incredible focus on scientific debates on social media, in public events, in regular media. And it's kind of exciting to see science highlighted as a process that includes skepticism and change, and that those are seen as admirable things and beneficial when done right, even by people who sometimes have to update their views. Trusting in science, of course, trades off with the human tendency to put that puts values on people rather than processes. So if you ask me, why do I trust Dr. Fauci, as many people do, maybe one of the most trusted people around, I'd say the reason is that I tend to trust him is that he has a history of being open and straight with people. It's the principle first, and that's the source of admiration for the principle. And with him, as with everyone else, if he says something, it's not that I accept it as unquestionable, but rather I accept that there is probably a good reason that I want to learn more about before taking some disagreement. I think the second thing I want to say is that our responsibilities in interacting with the public as scientists, and of course in interacting with other scientists, so I think there are additional responsibilities in internal interactions. Our simple responsibility is to describe the facts as best we understand them, to describe the uncertainties as best we understand them, and to do what we can to separate our view of these things from our policy preferences. Nobody does that perfectly, and we can acknowledge that. In trying to do that, I think the first time in this pandemic that I consciously was trying to do that was when a bunch of us were trying to get St. Patrick's Day parades canceled in cities on especially the East Coast, when it seemed like transmission was ramping up. And there was a narrative that had come from the 1918 flu history that the Liberty Loan Parade in 1918 in Philadelphia was what set off the pandemic in that town, in that city. That was a sort of, one thing happened and another thing happened and people attributed causality. There's no real data saying that that was the cause of why Philadelphia got hit hard. It was probably a symptom of the fact that Philadelphia was not otherwise closing down the city in 1918, and it did get hit hard. But the idea that the parade was a direct causal factor in the pandemic in Philadelphia would have been convenient as an argument for closing the St. Patrick's parades. But I made a conscious choice at that time not to say that, and in fact, when reporters asked about it, to say, well, it could be related, but the evidence of that is pretty slim. That seemed like the right thing to do at the time, and I think it was, but it became also very convenient some months later when the Black Lives Matter parades were happening, or protests were happening, and it was much easier to say with a straight face that these are essential activities, these are important things for people to do, they're outdoors, they're being done with masks. And by the way, I have never said that that outdoor activities are like protests or parades are in themselves something terrible that should always be shut down. So I was glad to have been a little bit moderate before, because the circumstances changed and it made it intellectually honest and easier to bear to stand on the principle that I felt at the time of the summer protests. The third thing I want to say is on a more positive note. I think one of the most exciting things about this whole terrible experience is the role of scientists over the last few years in positively shaping science policy, which will be critical to our route out of the pandemic. As some of you will know, in the midst of Ebola, 3 medical scientists, Stanley Plotkin, Adel Mahmoud, the late Adel Mahmoud from Princeton, and Jeremy Farrar, the head of the Wellcome Trust, proposed that we needed a facility to respond quickly in outbreaks by having vaccines and processes for making vaccines on the shelf that would be ready to go when a new event occurred. That led to the formation of CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. And that organization set out to produce exactly vaccines and platforms to be ready for surprises. This was a global effort, has been a global effort funded by donors and donor countries. Coronaviruses were one of their first bets, a lucky first bet, as well as a sensible first bet, as it turns out. And it seems absolutely clear to me that part of why vaccines are now really on the horizon is that a bold move was done at the urging of scientists to prepare for a low probability, high consequence event in the future. And I find that kind of gratifying. And then the last thing I want to say, I think, is on the more negative side, that the best science in the world without good leadership is pretty ineffectual. One of the best questions I've been asked by a journalist up till now is how the US, as one of the countries that has scored highest on the pandemic preparedness index, could have been one of the worst performers in this pandemic. And the simple answer, I think, is that country is the wrong unit of analysis. And I say that retrospectively. A year ago, I wouldn't have had this thought, but really it's country and regime. If you have a regime that is not prepared to lead a coordinated effort, then the best science and the best infrastructure it doesn't do much for you. So perhaps I should have inverted the 2 last points in order to end on a more positive note, but I think I'll stop there and look forward to hearing the others.
Thanks, Mark. We're approaching a regime change, so we'll see, I guess, how hopeful or unhopeful your last comment is. With that, let me hand it over to Ken for the next set of observations. Ken, the mute button is still on, I guess.
Sorry. Just very quickly, this is a current event response to this question of science, even as Mark's was, because we are in the middle of a messy census. So I will talk a bit about the census itself in order to make a larger point about what it means to trust in the census. The Bureau has announced that they have counted 99.9% of the American people. They have also had to have announced, or have announced more or less, but were forced into it, that the data that have been put together to count these 99.9% of people are full of errors. This is not unusual. All censuses have errors. We know about it. We know what to do about it. But the way in which they announced, making that the second and only under some pressure, was not a good signal in terms of getting people to have confidence in the census. And third, the particular mistakes that are now embedded in this document we call the census are particularly harmful to some of the most marginal and people who really need to have the data at hand. in order to make arguments for how they're being left off out of the benefit system that follows from a census. So they have kind of messed up how they handle the whole issue of being trusted. And I just want to emphasize that as we go forward. Now, let me say that to dig deeper into all of this, they really think of two different qualities of the census. One is what the Constitution wanted and got, which is a complete count of the entire population every 10 years. Used for reapportionment, redistricting, and in the last half century or so, allocation of public funds. And that, in the mind of the public, is the census. There is a different dimension of the census that has no big visibility, but it's enormously important, of course. And that's the science, if you will, of survey research in public policy, in commercial activity, and so forth. That is, the census itself, the narrow decennial census, is a denominator for all other reputable measurement systems that the country has, and indeed that the world has. The whole COVID thing rests right now, tracking it and so forth, rests upon denominators that come from the Census Bureau, and have to, because the COVID itself is not a census of anything. It's what's happening to a given number of people in different number of places and so forth and so on. So the first thing is that our definition of the census, and therefore trust in the census, is too narrow. And we are, and I'll get to this in a second, we're working on a way in which to broaden what trust means. The second thing about trust, also a very narrow thing, it's defined and discussed as, I don't want to answer this question because of what may happen to my answers. That is, I'm putting myself at risk in answering this question. That is not a good definition of trust. We actually want the American people, or people of any other country, to trust the numbers themselves and what they bring to our attention in our measurement systems. And so to sort of narrow the term trust to, will this be used against me, is not a very healthy place for the trust in the census to reside. Then I'll just move through a few just odds and ends about the census, and then try to put it all together. Another thing to know about the census is that, unlike, let us say, epidemiology or vaccinology, not everybody has to believe in it for it to be a census. And indeed, 20% of the American population doesn't want vaccinology, and so forth and so on. The census itself is constructed out of every individual responding, or one way or the other, we're getting data on them to put into the census. The census itself doesn't exist at 80%. That's an oxymoron. It only exists if you got 100% of the population. So that's the situation that we are in. So going forward, it seems to me that what we want to do is we want to get the American people to understand that the trustfulness has to be trustfulness in the number itself, in its accuracy and its spread, its uses, not just in will it hurt me if I answer this question. In fact, a census which is narrowed down to that terminology, oh, it's something we do every 10 years, and that's great. And I'm not going to answer it if I think it's going to be, my answer is going to be used against me. That's a powerful reason for not answering it. And we've had experiences with that in this particular census with things the Trump administration has done. But in effect, it's not what the game ought to be about. It's the game ought to be about that we do this marvelous thing, which has all of these statistical operations and expertise associated with it and so forth, in order to understand our country. And the confidentiality dimension of that is extremely important. We're having a big debate about it now, what's called differential privacy, and having a hard time getting that right. But it itself should not be our goal. Our goal should be, we decided to live in a measurement society some time ago. The whole world is now engaged in being a measurement society. We don't do anything with going out and getting the numbers put together. The census is the denominator for all of those numbers. And if we therefore want to build public trust in it, we've got to actually put the unit, the thing itself out there in the public differently than we have. And I'm very pleased to say that a bit of that is going on right now, and I think that will accelerate. We have had a census based upon people answering our questions when we knock on the door. The 2030 census will look less like the 2020 census than the 2020 census looks like the 1790 census. Say that again. The 2030 census, 10 years from now, will look less like the census we're now in, and I don't just mean because of Trump and so forth, than this census looks like the first census, knocking on doors, getting answers. The 2030 census will have a lot of new and important dimensions to it, including using data from other sources than the government itself, using what we call the third source data. And it will also depend more on administrative records and other ways in which we are collecting information about the society. So our challenge is, once we move into this much, much more complex measurement strategy for the census, is to make sure the American people understand it, not just as something that would be used for or against them, but something that is indispensable to how we govern our country and solve all the kinds of problems from COVID on down the line. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks for putting a puzzle on the table about complicating the means of collecting the numbers while also increasing the trust in the numbers. But maybe we can come back to that. But with that, let's segue to Ruha as our next speaker.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. This past May, the LA Times published an article entitled, "We Want to Study You." It starts with a profile of Jacqueline Temple, a 72-year-old resident of Leimert Park, the neighborhood where I happen to grow up in. Jacqueline describes experiencing weeks of respiratory problems, but when she took a COVID test, her results came back negative. So when she received an invitation to participate in an antibody study, she expressed hope that maybe it would tell her she'd been exposed but recovered. But then Jacqueline had what she calls a Tuskegee moment. Every time I think about experimental, or we want to study you, or there's no cure, but we can treat you, Tuskegee is in the back of my mind. Ultimately, though, Temple decided to go forward with the study. About a month ago, during the Q&A portion of a virtual talk I gave at Williams College, a student calling in from Brazil asked whether Black Americans' distrust of research could be one of the reasons that pharmaceutical companies go overseas looking for diverse populations to test drugs on. Are Black bodies in Brazil a proxy for Black bodies in the US, she asked. I couldn't say for sure, but what came to mind was anthropologist Adriana Petrina's work, When Experiments Travel. Petrina explains that while the NIH has mandated diversity in clinical trials, it is less clear how it is taken up in offshore research. And on Petrina's broad tours of trials around the world, one quickly gets the sense that there's much more going on behind the scenes than filling diversity quotas. In fact, the many different ways that data is manipulated to produce favorable results on the safety and efficacy of drugs would make even a die-hard science defender queasy. From 1993 to 1999, researchers at the Kennedy Krieger Institute at Johns Hopkins teamed up with Baltimore landlords and actively sought out families to take up residence in 107 apartments, knowingly exposing 140 newborns and children to lead paint in order to study the effectiveness of different lead abatement methods. Researchers periodically tested lead levels in the home and blood for the children, but at no time did children receive treatment. And although parents signed consent forms, the contract did not clearly and fully disclose the housing conditions or study objectives. In 2001, a Maryland Court of Appeals ruled that Hopkins researchers knowingly exposed children to lead, and once again, the judge invoked Tuskegee. For many Black folks, the touchstones of Tuskegee or of Henrietta Lacks resonate precisely because it is not a thing of the past. These examples echo in the insults and injuries loved ones continue to experience in ERs, clinics, nursing homes, not 50 years ago, but yesterday, with nary a headline, hashtag, or best-selling book to shine a light on. When I was a grad student conducting fieldwork in a Bay Area hospital, a Black sickle cell patient asked, "Why am I in such demand as a research subject when no one wants me as a patient?" Next door to the clinic was a program that offered families an experimental treatment that entailed umbilical cord blood transplants for children with congenital blood disorders. It was in this context where I was put in the position for the first and last time to serve as the Black face for an experimental treatment, speaking publicly about its benefits at a national conference. The question, "Why am I in such demand?" connects back to a longer history of medical apartheid and projects forward to forms of medical racism taking shape in the wake of COVID, where so-called trust issues rear their head again, and where finding Black faces to engender trust in a COVID vaccine is on the rise. In August 2020, the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, Ras Baraka, put out a statement on COVID-19 trials, noting that Rutgers was recruiting individuals for a clinical trial sponsored by Moderna. Quote, "The city of Newark cannot and did not authorize for any residents to partake in research," he wrote. "The trial is 100% voluntary and you have the right to say no." 3 days later, on September 2nd, the presidents of 2 historically Black universities released a statement acknowledging the legacy of Tuskegee, but encouraged, quote, Black and brown subjects to enroll in phase 3 vaccine trials so the vaccines could be, quote, understood across many diverse populations that comprise the US. The HBCU president said they had received their own injections and were being monitored for symptoms and side effects. "We are both well," they wrote. Ernest Grant, president of the American Nurses Association, is also participating in a COVID trial to, quote, improve accuracy and build trust. Frankly, I think far too much ink has been spilled on Black distrust in science and medicine. If it wasn't obvious, that distrust is earned. The question is, what are medical institutions doing to demonstrate their trustworthiness, concretely, not symbolically? No more grand announcements, no more forming committees and subcommittees about diversity and inclusion, no more Black faces in high places. But if Black distrust is the wrong issue, what is the right one? Bioethicist Derek Aye offers, after forcing Black people to suffer centuries of unethical medical experimentations, what does American medicine owe them? Equality is not enough to repair the racist dysfunction of the medical system, he writes. Just as America owes a debt for decades of unpaid slave labor, the medical system must pay reparations for its failure to treat Black bodies with care, end quote. So what might medical reparations look like? For IA, tackling America's segregated medical infrastructure requires investing, quote, in doctors' offices, hospitals, outpatient resources located in the community, and it means training doctors to focus on health issues prevalent in the community. And I would encourage us to think even more expansively about medical reparations and health justice. Towards that end, I'd like to pose one last question. What if, in remembering Tuskegee and all the long list of violations since, we also remember Onesimus? How might that help seed different possibilities? Onesimus was an enslaved African in Boston in the early 1700s who brought African medical knowledge about disease inoculation to the colonies. He was owned by a well-known minister and one of the key architects of the Salem witch trials, Cotton Mather. When Mather asked Onesimus if he'd ever had smallpox, Onesimus responded, yes and no, going on to explain how he was inoculated. People take juice of smallpox and cut his skin and put it in a drop. This practice, known as variolation, involved collecting infectious material like pus from a smallpox patient and administering it to others in a controlled manner to build up immunity. Cotton Mather soon learned that the practice was widespread among other Africans in the colony, and in fact, enslaved people with the scar in their arm indicating they were immune to smallpox fetched a higher price. In fact, not only was variolation common among Africans, but it was also practiced throughout the Ottoman Empire, China, India, long before Europeans discovered it. Teaming up with local apothecary Sabdiel Boylston, Mather set out to spread the practice of inoculation, but was met with intense resistance, not unlike the anti-vax sentiments that circulate today. According to one observer, Their rage came from many sources: fear that inoculation might spread smallpox further, knowledge that the bubonic plague was on the rise in France, and a righteous fury that it was immoral to tamper with God's judgment in this way. There was also a racial tone in their response, as they rebelled against an idea that was not only foreign, but African. One critic, an eminent doctor, attacked Mather for his Negroish thinking. But after things were all said and done and smallpox had ravaged Boston, the effectiveness of one Seamus's medical knowledge was hard to refute. Half of Boston's population of 11,000 was infected, with about 1 in 7 people dying of the disease. By contrast, of those who were inoculated, only 1 in 40 died. So it appears Negroish thinking when it comes to illness was a lifesaver. When it comes to engendering the trustworthiness of science and medicine, what would it mean for us to remember one Seamus as much as Tuskegee? Black people are not simply the objects of scientific mistreatment, but the inventors of medical knowledge. White people are not only the self-interested protagonists of scientific harm, but also the beneficiaries of African expertise. This recasting of roles and refutation of the white savior myth is essential, I think. The stories we tell about our collective past and present matter. We can all begin to tell different stories as part of repairing past harms and preventing future ones. Thank you.
Thank you for that eloquent intervention, Ruha, and it's a perfect segue with the focus on narrative and the kinds of stories we tell to Chris Mooney, who has some experience of trustworthiness of institutions as well.
Thank you, Sheila. And let me just say at the outset, I'm a reporter for the Post, but that means I'm just one of hundreds of journalists and editors who work there. So I don't speak for them or for the paper as a whole, just for me. But when it comes to trust in science and the media's role there, I feel the need to be a little realistic and a little humble, because whether the public trusts science on a given issue or in general, I think the media influences it, but we are only one of many factors that shape trust in science. There are educational factors, social, political ones, and when you talk about media, social media is increasingly dominant and not just traditional media. So there are factors beyond our influence. Climate change is definitely an example of this, which I cover. Scientists have struggled to fully gain the public's trust on the topic, and that's because in the United States, the issue maps onto this massive ideological fault line. The fault line has been, I think, really well defined by people like Dan Kahan at Yale. It's the same fault line that is dividing people over wearing masks right now. It's the rift between people who have a strong individualist disposition and people with an equally strong communitarian, emotional or moral system, to just sum it up. But in spite of that, the truth is that on climate change, public acceptance, which is certainly closely related to trust, actually appears to be increasing. I've just looked at the data from the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication, led by Anthony Leiserowitz. He breaks the US down into 6 Americas, ranging from the people who are most skeptical of climate change, he calls them the dismissives, all the way to those who are the most, quote, alarmed. And his data show that just over the past 5 years, the dismissives have declined, the alarmed have increased by 15%. And I didn't realize it was that much. But I felt the trend. Is the media the reason for that? I think our coverage has changed, its volume has increased, but I actually think that the reason for the change is the Earth. The planet in the past decade has been doing things that are impossible to ignore. And that includes multiple record-breaking temperature years. It includes recent shocking wildfire seasons in Australia and California. It includes evidence that a key part of Antarctica that has the potential to someday unleash 10 feet of sea level rise is already becoming destabilized. It includes the death of fully half of the Great Barrier Reef, a world treasure that we've really only known about since Captain Cook ran aground on it in 1770. And the majority of that damage, the death of half of the Great Barrier Reef, is just in the past 5 years. That last one just kind of takes my breath away. Corals have been hit so hard, and it makes you wonder if one of the main ecosystems of the planet will still be with us in 2100. And if you know anything about coral, it's this symbiosis between the coral, the coral animal is called the polyp, and the algae that lives inside of it. And the symbiosis, scientists have found, is 200 million years old. So it's an evolutionary strategy that has been around that long, and all of a sudden, it has been upended by rising ocean temperatures, which I think is really, really a stunning fact after existing for so long. So I think it's stark occurrences in the natural world that are driving how we think, but journalists definitely play a role because we are responding to the Earth and what scientists tell us is happening to it. So we're telling the planet's story. I want to just tell you a little bit about what has been probably our most successful attempt at the Post to do that. And this is a project that does go, I think, to what we can trust because it looked directly at the global temperature data, the data sets that multiple scientific groups keep. And ultimately, it's those data sets that determine our concern about climate change. And this is our 2 degrees Celsius series, which was already mentioned, which did win the Pulitzer for explanatory journalism. It was actually featured on Jeopardy last week. The category was Pulitzers, and for 800, the clue was the Washington Post won for a report on climate change named this number of degrees Celsius, the critical increase for global warming, and one of the contestants said, "What is 4?" And the next contestant said, "What is 3?" And the third abstained from guessing. So we have a ways to go. But the main point of the series was that climate change happens unevenly. Some places suffer more than others. Some have seen double or triple the global average increase of 1 degree Celsius. So some have seen 2, some have seen 3, and so on. It's really not fair. So climate change is not a problem for the future. Right now, it's actually creating severe impacts already, but you kind of have to know where to look because it's very uneven. So what we did was we set out to tell stories of the hotspots of climate change. A scientist named Daniel Pauly at the University of Columbia had this wonderful quote that he gave us. He said, the hotspots are, quote, chunks of the future in the present. We didn't just interview scientists, we actually worked with the temperature data. We learned how to use it. And then once we had started doing that, we went back to the scientists to make sure we were doing it right and to get their comments on the way we analyzed the data. So it was a process that was itself, I hope, quasi-scientific. And we've shared the US temperature data so people can use our analysis further themselves. I think it's a project, I hope, that shows how journalists, we rely on scientific expertise, but we don't regurgitate what scientists say. When we're at our best, we get deep into the information, we turn it around in our minds, we have it in our own spreadsheets, and we analyze it that way, and we find sometimes ways of looking at it that scientists themselves largely haven't. As far as building trust goes, I think one thing that was really important was the transparency we provided when it comes to looking at the data upon which climate change concerns are based. So evaluating that data, giving our methodology for how we evaluated it, citing the databases, and so on. One thing that we actually did was an entire, and this was a really fun part of the project, a full graphics and data story about how scientists know that climate change is real. And that was based on the historical temperature records themselves and just telling the story behind them. And after working for months on that, I'm not actually sure that scientists tell their own story in the most compelling way, because they'll say, oh, we now know that it's highly likely or extremely likely that humans are causing climate change and that the planet is this much warmer than it was 100 plus years ago. The real story is a story of adventures and risks and revelations. It's a story of explorers traveling the globe and taking temperature measurements as they traveled. It's the work of early meteorologists who placed an observatory high up in the Alps, and workers trudging through waist-high snowdrifts to get their measurement devices into place so that we can now compare the measurement in, say, 1886 with the measurements in 2020 and realize that 2 degrees Celsius of warming has happened. We couldn't do it if there weren't these early scientists actually beginning to take records. The story of climate change is really the story of science itself. And what was impressive for me was to go back and look in history to Benjamin Franklin and Captain Bligh of the Bounty, famous for the mutiny on the Bounty story, but he was recording temperatures right before the mutiny itself happened. They were all writing it down, and you slowly realize that the idea that the Earth's climate has warmed is based on these millions of records taken all over the world, beginning well over a century ago, and recorded in a denser and denser network over time by independent observers. So it's this massive collective data project. And once you recognize that, you realize that a gentleman scientist observer who was recording the temperature in Delta County, Colorado in the late 1800s, and this is a real example from one of our stories, this observer, he was doing so to predict the weather, help agriculture, and so on. I mean, he was a cattle rancher. He could not have known that 100 years later, we would use those data, among others, to determine that Delta County is 2 degrees Celsius warmer than it was back when the record began. I mean, that observer had no reason to make it up. The notion doesn't make any sense. So we ingested all this data. We found things that scientists, of course, knew on one level, but haven't highlighted in the way that we did, because we come at it from a different perspective. In the end, I think scientists and journalists were just, we're doing a very similar thing, but in different ways. We're trying to find out what's true. We're using methods that depend on what the data say, where the weight of the evidence lies, whether you can verify claims, whether multiple observers agree on them, and so on. Ultimately, we don't get to prescribe what people should trust, but we do have systems, norms, standards, methods. We take them seriously, and they're not perfect, but if you do away with them, are you going to end up with something that's more trustworthy? And I guess I would say probably not. And so I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Chris. So it's wonderful to see such a huge audience out there. And I'd like to, since we only have about 12 minutes left of the program, give people a chance to raise their questions. And there are 2 ways that you can do this. You can go to the participants button and raise your hand, or you can type a question into the Q&A section where you will have to identify yourself. I do have a comment about the 4 presentations, but in the interests of saving time, I won't ask you to respond. I think it's interesting the ways in which all of you have, to some extent, blurred the boundary between the lay and the expert. I mean, maybe the most dramatic example is the Washington Post itself deciding to become a citizen scientist if an institution as hoary as the Post can be said to be an individual as well, deciding to go out there and do the science. But in a sense, Ruha, in your talk, you were absolutely talking both with the Cotton Mather example, but also with people experiencing science on their own bodies in the here and now, as a blurring moment, and Marc talking about how to deal with people in a respectful way that embraces them into the very act of communicating and understanding science. And Ken, your invitation to people not to think about themselves as the unwitting recipients of bad behavior, but as producers of the trustworthy knowledge, being a part of the numbers making. So, that is a strand that I very much hope to explore, not just in what remains of today's meeting, but more generally. There are several questions in the Q&A box already. And although I'm tempted to ask the most crisp question, how do you trust numbers? Let me just put that out there in case one of you wants to respond to that. But I think this question about why should lay people trust science when with COVID-19, we already have members of the transition advisory team appearing with separate messages. This, I think, is a question that all of you might be able to answer, because you're all dealing with opinion and strong-minded statements coming from multiple quarters. So how should lay people deal with this welter of possible evidence? That is something that maybe each of you could take a minute to talk to. And if you want to fold in the trust in numbers point, you might do that as well. So Marc, let's go back to you since you began this chain, and see if you have a response to either of those 2 points.
Sure, thank you. I mean, on the trust in numbers thing, I think one thing that is really important and has become better understood by many people in the course of this pandemic is that epidemiologic data are fundamentally different from economic data and data from physical experiments or observations, in the sense that for all the limitations of an apparatus in calculating GDP or counting people or measuring the temperature, the limitations are more or less the same last year as they are this year, apart from the change in the census approach, but more or less comparable between last year and this year, and between Detroit and Blantyre, Malawi. And if they're not, we have an understanding of how. In epidemiologic data, we are building our apparatus, that is the surveillance systems, as we go. And particularly in the absence of national leadership, every county virtually is building it separately. And so the numbers they have very complicated ways that they come to be. And so the number of cases depends on the testing rate and on healthcare access and on the mix of people in the group and on the quality of the tests and all sorts of things, and is going to be different from place to place and time to time. So I think part of the challenge of trust in numbers is thinking of them not as hard data, but as they are in some sense hard data, but they are the outcome of a data generating process. And, people may not know all the details and want to understand the difference between a PCR and an antigen test. That's fine. But people are able to understand, in my opinion, and appreciate that if you look in different ways at something, you're going to get different numbers. And I think that's been a huge lesson of this pandemic for all of us, but especially for those who are used to seeing, especially for the physicists, frankly, who often tried to model things initially as if the numbers of cases were the numbers of cases, as opposed to the outcome of some complicated measurement process. In terms of who to trust and how to reconcile competing things, I won't say much. I'll just go back to what I said at the beginning. Trust the science, not the scientists. In other words, if people can give reasons for why they think something, that's one thing. If they can, if they invoke authority and don't have good reasons, infectious disease is complicated in many senses, but in some senses, just transmission from one person to another, and one case becomes 2 cases. That's not quantum mechanics. It's not hard to understand conceptually. We've all seen colds spread in our household. These concepts are understandable to people.
On a little bit, because there's very little time, and I want to
Thank
give
you.
the others a chance. But let's note that to some extent you've at least underscored another of the questions here, which is that trust in the process of science can lead to more robust knowledge when the skepticism is inside of the scientific community, but can be undermining when when the skepticism is from the outside directed in toward the scientific community. So let's take that as opening up a puzzle that we don't have sufficient time to get into. Ruha, there's a direct question to you that perhaps you'd like to respond to from Sally Lerman. So from the Trust Project, of which the Washington Post is a news partner, So both Ruha and Chris mentioned story, but described very different stories and sources of those stories. How would each of you recommend the journalists find better, more compelling and inclusive stories? So this again hits exactly the point I was asking about before. How does one deal with a world in which there are competing stories? So Ruha, how about you next? But
Sure.
very quickly, and then Chris.
The nutshell version is I am inclined to always think about whose perspectives are stories highlighting, articulating, whose are they ignoring, downplaying. I'll give you a very concrete example of this when it comes to the stories I told in my brief reflections. If you go to Wiki and you look up the Kennedy Krieger Institute's lead-based paint and abatement and repair and maintenance study, which was the official name of that study, you won't find anything about it. But if you type in Baltimore lead paint study, you will find the profile of that. That shift from highlighting the institution to highlighting the place, for me, is significant in storytelling. We also see the same occurrence as people remember and talk about Tuskegee. It wasn't called the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. It was the US Public Health Service syphilis study. But we don't name the official institution that was involved in crafting this 40-year experiment on Black bodies. And this also relates to the story about teachers. Let's look at the language, the naming as power, as the first step in crafting different stories and calling into question the stories that we currently tell that too often hide the institutional protagonists that create various kinds of harms, and then instead stigmatize the place and the people who are most vulnerable in the story.
Thanks, Ruha. And Chris, maybe while you answer the question about narrative, you could fold in this question from Alfred Spector about what should the press do better to help the public make sense of often conflicting scientific data?
Well, so on just telling better, more compelling, inclusive stories, I mean, it's important for the media, diverse journalists find diverse stories. And so diversity is a huge strength to journalism. People who have lived different experiences will have different things to tell us. So we have to talk to a lot of different kinds of people. That's the general statement. I will tell you how an amazing story in the 2 degrees Celsius series that we're all very proud of came about, and that was that that is relevant to this, which is that there was a hot spot off the coast of Tasmania and in the ocean. And Daryl Fears did a lot of research and ultimately traveled there, and he found that what was really the most striking thing about it is that kelp forests had died off in massive numbers because the ocean water was so hot. But what that in turn meant was that Tasmanian Aboriginals who had already experienced something that could be called a genocide, so there are very few of them left. And the way that their culture was recognized was through the practice of having a seaside culture that was in turn dependent upon the kelp, which had been devastated, and they made jewelry, they made baskets from the kelp, and these artifacts were part of the basis for their recognition. Climate change was not only taking away a fishery, but it was taking away a culture and the culture's way of actually being recognized. And so that ended up being a really powerful story where climate change actually intersects with a lot of other things. What should the press do better? I mean, in dealing with claims and counterclaims, I've thought a lot about this. It's the practice of science journalism. If you can trust a science journalism story more, if you see it characterize the uncertainty in the findings, that's really critical because science is always characterized by some degree of uncertainty. And if the story is blowing by it, then that's a problem. You need to know just how certain scientists are of what's being said. You want to look for journalism that avoids both alarmism and its opposite. Usually neither is actually right. So you want to see the weighing of evidence in different studies. You want to hear different voices, not just the ones that are behind the research, characterizing it, putting it into context, and discussing its strengths and weaknesses. And I could go on, but there's a lot of tools and practices there.
Don't go on because we have to
Yes, sorry.
go off in a sense, but I want to give Ken the last word. So Ken, there is a question directly to you about differential privacy, but do not go into that because it would take far too long. But instead, could you just give us some just very quick thoughts on the two things that have been said in a sense? I mean, one is to rely on the as it were, the technological fix, and that the scientists produce a robust consensus and then leave that to be trusted. And the other is, in some sense, a political fix, which is either to draw the people more directly into the production of the knowledge, or in other ways to acknowledge the exclusion of some people from the production of knowledge. So where do you stand on that spectrum? And how do you think the census, which is so foundational, can bridge that gap?
Let me put it this way. The Congress decides that we need a fighter plane for our defense. And they say to the engineers, go build me a fighter plane. And then at the end of the day, after the plane's there, the Congress and various other places decide to use that plane. In between, they were left alone. The engineers, the scientists were to build the thing. If they hadn't been left alone to build the thing, it wouldn't do its job. The census is just like that. The purpose of the census can be political, as it is, allocate monies, allocate power. And the in use of the census can sometimes be political, but the production of the numbers themselves have got not to be weaponized. And we have to get the public to understand the difference between getting the numbers right, correct, accurate, and how they are used. And I think that's doable. I don't think we framed it that way, but I think that's doable. And that's what I think we all ought to dedicate ourselves to. If we don't save the science for it's because it is accurate, then we have no reason to be saving it.
Thank you very much. I think that crisply touches on the two dimensions of today's program, the leaving the engineers to their own devices while they figure out how to solve the problems. Of course, it's not their own devices because there's eons of training and discovery and professional ethics and so on and so forth going into it. But then that other separate face of also increasing trust in use. And with that, let me thank all of the different components that made today's programs possible. The researchers themselves who presented in the workshop that initiated the morning, all four of you speakers, Marc, Ken, Ruha, and Chris, for sharing your time and your experience and your wisdom with us. The sponsors of this Trust in Science project, Bayer and Microsoft, for having the confidence that academics can be left to their own devices in the ways that Ken is suggesting is essential if we're going to produce robust knowledge, and above all, the HDSI and the Trust in Science team, consisting first of all of my colleague Sam Weiss-Evans, and then the heads of the Harvard Data Science Initiative project, David Parks and Francesca Dominici, and their assistants, including Liz Langdon-Gray, Kevin Doyle, and Jen Chow, and others whom I may not know by name, for all of the hard work in bringing this together. We've obviously opened up a huge cornucopia of questions, and their answers, I hope, will bring all of us together more than once. So thank you very, very much for this event.